Hello, everyone. I'm Tracy Charles McGee with Unerased Amplified, and today we're honored to spotlight an extraordinary scholar and storyteller, Dr. Martha S. Jones. You may know her as the author of Vanguard and her brand new book, The Trouble of Color, which is already making major waves. Martha is one of our primetime luminaries, someone who has long been amplifying the untold stories of Black women and illuminating the history often erased. Martha, we thank you for being with us today.
It is my pleasure to be here. So thank you so much for doing this with me.
I'm so excited about your new book, The Trouble of Color. Um, Tell me what has sharing this story right now meant to you as you're touring around the country.
This story is one about one family, my own family across 5 generations. I think what I didn't wholly anticipate were the stories that would pour out as I visit, libraries and bookstores, um, and I meet folks who are carrying their own family stories and have been carrying them for a long time, not unlike me, and are eager and feel the necessity of passing those stories on. And so it's been an extraordinary honor to hear some of those stories and to be part of that bigger conversation.
Yes, I can only imagine. So, what specifically inspired you to write this book?
Well, as you mentioned at the top, I'm a historian by training, and that's usually the genre in which I write. But when I tried to write down my family stories, history really fell short, and the writing was flat. It wasn't very good, and I had to ask myself why that was. And I think the principal reason was that I was holding back, that I was trying to be a removed or an objective researcher when really I'm a daughter and a granddaughter and a descendant. And so in this book, I step fully into that role, into that identity, and came to realize that this is the way most of us come to family storytelling, not as researchers, though there's research in this book, but really as family members, as descendants.
Absolutely. Um, and so I was reading the book, and there was this instance where an archivist had said they can find something that you were looking for. And this was very important information about one of your ancestors and her sisters. Can you tell me about that moment in the story, knowing that if you had just listened to that archivist, you would have missed something very important?
Sure. My great grandmother, Nancy Bell Graves, was born and lived her life in central Kentucky in the city of Danville. And I had never been to Danville. It's quite a ways from where I was living at the time. And so you're right that I wrote to an archivist and asked if they would help me uh, have a first look at the papers of a man who had been the last person to call Nancy property. He had been her owner until slavery was abolished.
Mm.
And the archivist, I think, was good intentioned. And he went through the papers. I don't know how thoroughly or, how quickly or how slowly. But he wrote me back and he said, there's nothing there. And it really gnawed at me for a long time. And it took me 10 years, but I finally made the trek myself. And I had to slog through box after box of correspondence, and it was seemed true. I was finding nothing. But in the very last box, as it would be, right? In the very last box, in the very last ledger, there was a page for a woman named Betty. And Betty was a former slave um, whom this man had kept accounts for after slavery's abolition. And I could see that he had fronted money for medicine, um, and her care by a doctor. And she passed away, and he fronted the money for her burial.
Mm,
And then at the end, a few years later, he comes back and he says, I'm going to do a final accounting of Betty's account. And Betty is owed some money by me because I had been holding her funds.
mm,
And I'm going to divide that money among her sisters, Tina and Nancy. And there I realize is my great 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 grandmother. Now, if I could put it this way, you know, much bigger than that identity, um, that I had ascribed to her, a former slave.
mhm,
She was a sister,
mhm,
and everything about her for me changed because I could reimagine her life then in the company of Tina and Betty, and that she had never been alone. She had never been without family. And that was one of my questions in this book, is about who we call family, how we make family. And I realized she had always been in the company of these two sisters. And I think that tells us so much about the life that she lived.
yes, it allowed you to connect the dots
Yes.
and have a fuller narrative.
Yes, but at the same time, I sort of had to trust my gut, and my gut told me that despite this archivist's first look at these materials, there might still be something there, and that I was really the person who had to go and have a look and be sure.
Mhm. I'd like to think that Nancy had a place in that, giving you that ancestral nudge to go back there.
Absolutely.
Yes. So for our unerased community, many of whom are looking for ways to engage, heal, and make an impact, as a historian, what advice would you give us on how to use history as a tool or blueprint for these really challenging times that we find ourselves in?
Um, One of the things I learned in this book that I thought I knew, but I learned it in a new way, was about putting my faith in not only family, but in the stories that we tell. Um, Now, every generation has its own story to tell, and the story I tell is not the same as those told by the generations before me. But in order to tell my story in a faithful way, in a way that I think sustains me in the present, I had to really learn to trust, the notes scribbled on the back of a photograph, or a small mention in a letter, or just the stories I heard, at a holiday table or the kitchen. I had to really learn to trust those stories, and then to gather them up. Because to your question, I think we all are facing the profound challenge of grappling with how to face some extraordinarily challenging times. And for me, um, revisiting the challenging times of our ancestors has turned out to be emboldening,
Mhm,
right? That um, this is not where we would want to be in our history, but it's where we find ourselves, just like, my great grandparents experienced, as many of ours did, the disappointments and more of the violence and more of um, the collapse of Reconstruction and the rise of Jim Crow. That is not where they wanted to be. It's not where what they dreamed for themselves. But we know the kind of courage, the fortitude, and more that they brought to that cataclysm.
mhm,
And if we are indeed in our own cataclysmic time, um, I hope for readers, this book is an encouragement to gather up the stories that we know, to learn some of the stories we don't know, and to be emboldened by them, just as I think our ancestors, many of them were in their own times.
Absolutely. So give someone who's not a historian, who's getting together with their family, maybe, during Mother's Day or over, during the summer or any special family gathering. What would you suggest to begin this research or this process of uncovering stories?
Yes. Um, uh, Coming up, we have Mother's Day, as you mentioned, we have Easter, summer holidays, and more. Um, I think there are two things. One is learn how to use that recording device, app on your phone, which is to say, when I started this work, I was still taking notes with pen and paper, and I still like to take notes that way. But uh, many of us are carrying devices now that let us record not only the recollections, but the voices of our elders. And so I recommend using that liberally as you prod folks to share their memories. Now, there are two things to say about memories. Being mindful that some memories are painful,
Mm,
um, unsettling.
mm,
And so um, that I think requires us to really hone our capacity for compassion and for patience on the one hand. And on the other hand, if you've got any kind of artifacts at home, some of us have been online and we've found census returns or birth or death certificates, photographs. Bring those with you, because these are the kinds of things that can really um, light up a memory for people. Just reciting the names on a census return or a photograph. Where was this taken? When would have been? Who are these people in the photo? These are the kinds of questions, in my experience, that open up and sort of clear the cobwebs, right, of memories that have been sitting quietly or sitting dormant for a while. And then watch who joins in, because I think that's part of the extraordinary part of family storytelling is once the stories get going, then they begin to roll. Um, and the last thing is, don't argue with folks. I think there's a temptation, right, to get the story right. And I thought that was my job initially, but it turns out there is usually a truth in every story that is told. It doesn't mean that it lines up, fact by fact with the record, but that's not the point of family storytelling completely. That family storytelling is partly about the stories we need to tell, we want to tell, the ways in which we craft stories that help us grapple with what was wonderful and what was difficult. So I think becoming a good listener is a last piece of this. And you can argue with these stories later on, but let them come out just as they are, and let them be a site for reflection before you begin to try and correct the record.
right, because there are um, what we call tall tales, and there are exaggerations, and there are just add a little razzle dazzle to the story. So we just need to investigate why they're telling the story in that way. That might provide some insight.
I think that you just hit it on the head. I think that it's just as interesting to understand why someone told the story or didn't tell the story, um, as it is to figure out what really happened, right? Because there's truth in all of that, and particularly family truth, right? And silence is a kind of family truth, just as tall tales are a kind of family truth. And so in this book, I tell those things also, and let readers think about why someone would tell, a fanciful tale rather than just the facts.
Absolutely. Dr. Jones, thank you so much for sharing your wisdom and for continuing to give voice to the stories that need to be told. We are honored to have you as part of our 55 Prime Timers community. For our viewers, please be sure to pick up the trouble of color and explore more of Dr. Jones' work. You can find the full interview and more spotlights on our website and YouTube channel. Until next time, keep amplifying, keep connecting, and keep unerasing.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.